Morning, good noon, good evening, Asiya. If you read the description of my talk today, you'll know it's not one talk, it's several talks. I'm going to try to give 10 talks. I actually timed myself doing this yesterday, and it was about 36 minutes. And then I blew it up and added stuff. So I'm sure we'll have time left for questions. Put anything you want in the chat as we go. I probably won't check it because I'm going to be on fire. Hope you'll be on fire too. Here it goes. If thou dislikes what thou first lightest on, speed talks on various subjects, poetic and otherwise. Talk 1, preamble. So these talks are really only one talk. And the larger topic is something like how to live and what to do. But I don't mean that in a prescriptive way. I mean it as Wallace Stevens meant it in a writerly, philosophical way. I mean it as an invitation. I mean it to encourage you to continue to allow writing to be one of the forms of your life. Maybe as a result of this, you might even, if you haven't already, come to think of writing and your life as extensions of each other. Maybe your writing life and your life are the same thing, such that your life enters your writing and your writing mixes up with your life. And before you know it, you aren't merely making art, but you are the art, something imagined and reimagined endlessly. As a writer, you were being written as much as you were writing and reading and thinking and moving through the space that curves around you and through the time that you've been given on this earth, not to mention also with and against the parameters you've inherited and created. Here's a quote from Robert Duncan's Writing to start us off. Quote, "When I imagine not overcoming, but including, loving takes place in the place of desiring. When I imagine daily beginning, continuing, being is no longer reforming, but repeating." On this idea that Duncan brings up about not overcoming, but including, I would like to make something explicit. Dislike and even hatred, exclusion, are rather easy in that they only require that one rejects something. But loving anything is difficult, especially if it's hard to love, because it requires that you open yourself to it generously with vulnerability, that you make room for it in your life. Is there room in the room that you room in? The poet Ted Berrigan wrote in his great book, The Sonnets, a book which explodes that received loving form to embrace new and far-flung possibilities via collage and the radical inclusion of things like lines, stanzas, and entire poems by his friends, translations of other poets' works, the titles of movies and books, Gertrude Stein, Marilyn Monroe, William Carlos Williams, and the sonnet is not dead. Hatred is always a matter of exclusion, dismissal, repudiation. It is a closing off of possibility. Let us make room in our lives and our writing lives for the whole of the world and everyone and everything it points to. This is not easy. The human heart is wildly large. It is Poems by Pierre Reverdee. It goes boom, 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 boom. Talk 2. On call and response. I am sort of obsessed with the idea of poetry as an echo and expansion of the first human utterance, which I imagine wasn't sense, but expression, a call for a response and a response to a call. How could it have been otherwise? We make sense with words, and this would have been before words, a hum over the water. That first wasn't a word, but it was nevertheless something meant to be communicative, if only of the feelings, the inner life of the speaker, screamer, not an I, which is somebody else, but an audio apparatus projecting a sound. The human voice an amplifier. Language did not arise out of any form of ratiocination, wrote Wittgenstein in his mind-blowingly patient epistemological work, Notes on Certainty. The implication is perhaps instead that it arose from need, necessity, a desire, a compulsion via pain or ecstasy or banality to speak, which is to vocalize intentionally. In his later philosophy, Wittgenstein would have called this context of need, necessity to get it out, a form of life. The soul was pricked and sounded the throat's alarm from the body. With that first responder, a mechanism was activated, and presumably other ears heard it, at least eventually, so other ears were opened. So too were other mouths. An endless volley ensued, and it continues still, sound to sound, word to word, being to being, and being. Poetry is language made noisy with God. And yet, most of the instances in which we deploy language don't involve emergency or the overflow of powerful emotions or the sacred. We tame the river of expression into sense, which is more efficient, easier to digest, easier to get, easier to ignore. Sense makes money. Nonsense, imagination, poetry makes the world. One might say that this kind of call and response is the most super of supernatural inventions. How bizarre to connect our inner lives with the outer world and to receive the inner lives of others into ourselves. As the physicist Carlo Rovelli noted, we are nodes in a network of exchanges. Even our atoms whisper one to another, back and forth to compose who we are, a call for response to a call. Talk 3. What's the matter? This morning I walked downstairs a little grumpy maybe, and my teenage soon-to-be an adult daughter took one look at me and asked, "What's the matter?" "Nothing," I said. "I just woke up." And while I was making coffee, I thought about a bit of an interview that I had read with the composer Morton Feldman. In it, he's talking about the poet Frank O'Hara's work and its importance, noting that, quote, "Bad artists throughout history have always tried to make their art like life. Only the artist who is close to his own life gives us an art that is like death." His point was that O'Hara, who he believed to be a good artist, was in fact close to his own life and wrote poems that, for all their talkiness and frenetic electrified verve, always had shadows, i.e. they presented us with the specter of death. I think, generally speaking, that Feldman is right about O'Hara's work, which is busy, lively, doing this and doing that, and because of the closeness to life, always also, on some level, points us to the fact that life ends. O'Hara's poems are literally and literarily a matter of life and death. On the other hand, Feldman's quote is also a sort of goofy false dichotomy. Life and death are so mysterious, both philosophically and mechanically. No one knows what they are. No one can definitively explain them. No one can write them. What gave rise to life? What is the nature of death? No one knows. But insofar as any art is a matter of life and death, I would argue that what artists are really doing is asking over and over again, what is the matter? And here, matter is being used in two ways, as substance and problem. In other words, what is the matter means, what is the substance of life, and how do we deal with the problem that it ends? Art and all the talk about it happens between life and death, in the ordinary and extraordinary moments of our lives, or this morning, in my particular circumstances, betwixt the closeness and distance of me and my daughter. Talk 4. Just like Tom Thumb's blues. The people in my workshop will appreciate this for sure. Recently, I went to an audiologist for a hearing test. So now I have this report on my ears, which I first typed as eras. I've been hard of hearing for a while now, and my eras, which are always ears, ring sort of ecstatically. The report says I have severe hearing loss in my left era and moderate hearing loss in my right era. Last night, my wife Melanie and I were watching a documentary about Bob Dylan, and we had the subtitles on like we always do when we watch TV so that I can keep up with what's happening on the screen without having to turn the television up so loudly that it damages the hearing of everyone else in the room. In one scene from a 1966 concert, Dylan was singing his song, Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues. And I realized that I've been mishearing the lyric, Goddess of Gloom, as Goddess of Glue for all the years that I've been listening to that song, which is more than 30. I like Goddess of Glue so much better than Goddess of Gloom. Possibly my hearing loss allows me to hear things more interesting, at least some of the time. Goddess of Glue makes no sense in the song, but the rhyme it creates against the word room at the end of the next line is a much more interesting rhyme, i.e. gloom rhymes with room in the original, but in my version, which is a whole new era, glue rhymes with room. And who would ever think we'd need a goddess of glue? And what if there are many goddesses of glue corresponding to the different kinds of glue, e.g. the goddess of model airplane glue, the goddess of super glue, the goddess of Elmer's glue, Gorilla Glue, the goddess of Loctite, liquid skin, mouse traps. All these years, I thought Bob Dylan was onto something, but now I know it was only my ears. I am not gloomy about it. The goddesses will always be glue to me. Talk 5. Everything turns into writing. My only tattoo is just 4 words, a quotation from Ted Berrigan's The Sonnets. Everything turns into writing. To me, that seems wonderfully generous and generative and also totally obvious. Language is the fundamental conceptual framework by which we make sense of the world, ourselves, and our experience, other people, the silence, the red tractors and the platypuses and grot, the grit, the pink insulation. Thinking is writing. Speaking is writing. Reading is writing. Even our bodies are writing. And I don't just mean that they're text to read. That's definitely true. But even more, we are, all of us, a process of becoming, of beginning and ending. Though I realize that elsewhere in these paragraphs, I said or I say, nothing ends. Do I unravel myself? Very well, I unravel myself. Maybe I am capably negligible or decaying lamplight or cussed concussedness. Everything's a translation of something else. Everyone's a translation of somebody else. And all these texts are connected, I guess. What I'm trying to say is there is only one inexhaustible text, and we derive ourselves from it. All of us are derivative and totally our own. Star bones connected to the tree bones connected to the word bones connected to the wolf bones, and all of them connected to the space bones and darkness. The process just goes, expands as it goes. Everything turns into writing, even writing itself, because writing is, even now, writing itself. And that means nothing is fixed, not frozen in terror and not preordained. All of us are little pieces broken off of something else. Sentences, lines, phrases, names, owls stuffed with images, which themselves are stuffed with images. Talk 6, the resistance. Recently, I wrote a poem called The Resistance. It's a poem of 8 quatrains and establishes a pattern where almost every line ends with the phrase, is a poem. For example, here are the first couple of stanzas. It happens one Monday in Westwood is a poem. A fly-covered jelly-filled chipmunk is a poem. Americans buy American in Mexico City is a poem. Pork chop and sour cream is a poem. It's never for me to decide it is a poem. Crushing a can on my forehead is a poem. Eternal and serious, a drawer full of socks is a poem. John Keats brushing his teeth with a thistle is a poem. Obviously, one of the things the poem is in resistance to is the idea that only certain subjects or ideas are worthy of being included or rendered as poems. And as such, it seeks to remind us that one way anything can be a poem is if a poet says it's so. In fact, My poem, The Resistance, uses the phrase is a poem 24 separate times to transform things as disparate and admittedly unhighbrow as a rip in the crotch of someone's jeans or asparagus or cancer or a gesture into poetry, simply by saying that they are a poem. On its face, this is nothing new or very controversial, given the ways that the 20th century avant-garde expanded the possibilities of artistic media and undermined essentialism and cultural pieties about the nature of art. My poem is very much in line with Marcel Duchamp's declaration via selection and his title In Advance of the Broken Arm, that an ordinary snow shovel can be both itself a work of art and or a reminder of the idea that art isn't necessarily something made, but something an artist chooses and or conceives of as art. Nowadays, the question isn't what makes something a work of art, but rather, given that a claim is made that some given X is art, why does it matter as art? In other words, the aesthetic questions that remain for us in the 21st century aren't about essential nature. They are questions about value and or the language we use to talk about it. That said, just because anything can be a work of art, or in the case of The Resistance, which is a poem, that doesn't mean that everything is. To organize words into lines and stanzas, or even just to declare in a poetic context that something or other is a poem is enough. Of course, that doesn't mean it has any significant value as a poem. One might, for example, argue that one issue with my poem, The Resistance, is the ridiculousness with which it repeats the phrase is a poem, and especially repeats the word poem in a poem, thus constantly reifying the poem's artifice and the fact that it's being written. There is, among poets, a sort of mostly unspoken rule that one shouldn't use the word poem too much in a poem. It suggests that one doesn't have much to say, or that one is navel-gazing, and it demeans the sanctimonious seriousness of what it means to be a poet and to write a poem. But how many novels, some of them great, are there about writers writing a novel or trying to and failing? Maybe there's some good rules of thumb, re how to proceed and what's acceptable, but I don't like rules. And The Resistance is obviously being ridiculous with its repetition. It isn't unknowingly making a mistake, it is deliberately making the mistake, and so egregiously that it demonstrates both an awareness of the unspoken rule, not to use the word poem, and an insistence that the rule can be broken in an interesting way. It's this last part, though, that needs to be shown, though it might come down to a matter of taste. Now, there are reasons behind a given poetic choice doesn't make it normative. All the reasons in the world don't make a poem's value any less subjective. Undertake making an argument about that if you want to. I am not an undertaker, and talking poems to death is so much less enjoyable than writing and reading them. P.S. Also, I am well aware of the general rule that one shouldn't use one's own work as an example in a talk they're giving. This rule is also a poem. Talk 6, a beginning. I keep thinking I'll begin these talks, or hoping I will, but of course, almost no one who writes begins with hope. One begins with words, which are significantly without hope. Even the word hope has no hope in it. So I guess that makes me hopeless to begin with and to end with. But I begin, having begun, nevertheless. What I have to start is a coming to in a process every day, one that evolves not for a goal, but for its own continuance and mine, since as long as I am writing, I am not dead. I actually enjoy doing this work, which is play. And I don't mean that in a diminishing way. I mean it as an opportunity to see. Many people in my experience don't see. Some don't see because their circumstances make that sort of thing impossible, but others choose not to see. It's easier, more practical, rationalizable. Who needs the shadow of a geranium? Who wants less certainty, more inconsistency, more contradiction, more of what's contrary? Well, I do, and all my loves do. I hope you understand and that you are one of the dear ones. There is, in fact, some hope in that. As of this writing, I am this very day recording some new songs with my band. I wrote a poem rather grotesquely titled Shepherd's Pie and emailed it to a friend. I need to take a shower, buy some chicken, experimental IPA. The world flows through me and I am trying to hold on to it. Ted Berrigan, his costume, Gregory Corso, his distortion, Wanda Coleman, her blaze. I bleat with the sheep, and then an ending. Talk 7, New Day Rising. I'm going to play you a little piece of something here to get this started. Probably only play 30 seconds of it or so. All right. I hope that woke you up. New Day Rising. There is something at once both cataclysmic and, upon repeated listens, almost meditative about the opening title track of the punk band Husker Du's third studio album, New Day Rising. The album was released in January of 1985 on the heels of the Minneapolis-St. Paul-based trio's double record, Opus Zen Arcade, which had only been released about 6 months earlier in July of 1984. The song begins with drummer Grant Hart's, no relation, drummer Grant Hart's unmistakable double-time hardcore beat, snare hit after snare hit, shotgunning the sun, the moon, the stars, followed by the washy ribbon of guitarist Bob Mould's now iconic chorusy distortion and Greg Norton's concussive and propulsive bass playing. The song proceeds tectonically with the vocals, guitars, and drums shifting in layers, dancing around each other, crescendoing and decrescendoing. Like the sun itself, the song is both blaring and relentless. Its intensity is constant, even as it storms and burns. It's 2.5 minutes of crashing through a wall, of undoing the horizon, shedding new light on an old problem, how to live and what to do. Lyrically, the song couldn't be more simple, almost koan mantra-like in its compactness, brevity, and repetition. New day rising, new day rising, new day rising, new day rising. It's just that phrase, repeated, singing, screaming, soaring, blasting, the entire length of the song. Both Bob Mould and Grant Hart sing lead on this one, their voices twining, intertwining, twinning, and diverging. It's not a matter of harmony, or not only of harmony, but entanglement, empathetic, murderous, and hopeful. Hart's and Mould's melodies literally overlap and tangle with each other, almost as if the group's two chief songwriter vocalists are in a sort of melodic wrestling match, each for a time briefly overpowering the other, back and forth in waves, the two voices circling, a radiant fusion of one with the other, companionable and oppositional simultaneously. And the band's other non-vocal instruments functioning like a glue that holds it all somehow together. The lyric New Day Rising is only a phrase, but one that's observational and declarative both. It's a line, but barely a line at just 3 words. And in terms of the way the phrase is delivered musically, it's an I am followed by a trochee, i.e. it's an unaccented syllable followed by an accented one, then another accented syllable followed by an unaccented one. In other words, the phrase itself rises and falls. It's not one new day rising, but many of them, a reminder of the endless repetition of sunrises and sunsets. The line is a line in the sand between yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And in all of it are new possibilities, new things on the never-ending to-do list. As such, it's both artistically open-ended and recognizably humane in the dailiness of its reoccurrence. Minimal, adrenalized, and catchy as hell, New Day Rising is the quintessential earworm, one that complicates and concentrates the ferocity of punk rock in conjunction with a melodic sensibility that is indeed soulful, expressive, and ridiculous with its hook. Ridiculous only because the song is only a chorus, almost literally a broken record, but it's singable, even when the actual singing is a scream. Weirdly, one can sing with it by singing against it. Try it out if you don't believe me. Turn on New Day Rising, turn it up really loud, and when the song starts, just belt out the phrase in whatever voice you've got. New Day Rising, New Day Rising, New Day Rising, over and over, with and against what Hart and Mulder are already doing. You'll fit right in. The new day will rise on you as with them. There's an ecstasy to this, both singing along and being sung through, a true sense of abandon, the rush of a new beginning that points back to where it came from and way out into the future. New Day Rising is the sun coming up on a whole new era. The window opens like an orange, lovely fruit of light, wrote Guillaume Apollinaire at the end of his great collage poem, Windows. And New Day Rising is nothing if not full of light, a source of it, a fusion and an effusion of the past with the future in the present, which is all we ever have. Don't be deceived, but definitely let it take you. Here's something else from Apollinaire that seems relevant. Even if there is nothing new under the sun, he wrote in his great 1911 essay, The New Spirit and the Poets, there are still infinite combinations of all that is not new under the sun. Husker Du on New Day Rising discovered a new language for punk rock by combining elements of hardcore with pop songcraft. As a line in the sand, the song New Day Rising begins the record with an ending that begins, a battle cry repeating the echo of what's next. And what that is really any good ever happened without a fight? My friend Sam said after hearing me read the above. What indeed? There's a sense in which every new day is a struggle. And I don't mean that in some overblown dramatic way. I mean that as organisms, every day is another day to live. But what does really living consist of? And what will it or can it amount to? New Day Rising is a really good song, a great song, and that's enough. But if I might allow myself to be just a little amused, I already mentioned that the phrase New Day Rising is explicitly both observational and declarative, but it's also implicitly an imperative. It's a brand new day, i.e., get to work. I hope everybody's doing all right. Talk 8, Record Store Day. It's a Tuesday in the middle of the day as I write this, so I'm at my part-time record store job. The hardest things about being here are 1, not spending all the money I make on more records, and 2, deciding what to play during my shift. This morning, thus far, I have listened to the Modern Lovers' first record, and currently I'm listening to Fish by Shit Kid. Next, I will play Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath or Doolittle by the Pixies, followed by recent reissues by Run DMC and Toxic Reasons. Beyond that, we'll have to see how I'm feeling when the time comes, which is always. So I'm staying busy and paying as much attention as possible and obviously making lists again. I say again because I'm always making lists, playlists, to-do lists, grocery lists, lists of words, lists of titles, lists of possibilities for these very short talks, lists of lines, which is what a poem is. All the while, I'm also doing my best to engage in activities where I don't know what the outcome will be when I start. Or maybe I mean that I'm trying to stay open to the possibility that things will not turn out the way I think. I don't have to follow where the lists lead one item to the next. Every item on any list points as much or more outside the list as it does to the next items on it. Every day's sequence of choices and decisions is a gift and full of the unexpected, which means that process can always result in surprise, for better or worse. Poems are lists of lines, and who knows where they go, what they point to, who they touch. I figure if I'm surprised, other people might be as well. Life is a poem. Writing is making a recording of that poem, however incomplete, however momentary, fragmented, snipped off, transformed, or reimagined. In her book-length poem, Midwinter Day, written on December 22nd, 1978, Bernadette Mayer writes, I had an idea to write a book that would translate the detail of thought from a day to language, writing continuously for as long as I can, because having it all at once is performing a magical service for survival. Writing is performing a magical service for survival, to memorialize and monumentalize life, to transform experience into communicable possibility. Similarly, The poet John Wieners, in his essay Lanterns Along the Wall, writes that poetry is the most magical of all the arts. Trees are stripped. The sky deepens. A billion possibilities are packed inside each and every moment, and even in the most ridiculous menial tasks and activities. Put on a record, make a list, say the word, put it and anything, everything, what piques you, bores you, exhausts you on the page, humming under your breath, drinking coffee, talking to a friend, making a to-do list, follow your hunches. Have faith in the dictionary. You are performing a magical service and being formed by it and changed through the surprises it brings. Talk 9, misremembering. Today I took a walk and talked to myself. What we talked about is us. It seems we aren't well acquainted with ourselves. So the elephant in the room is a singular lack of focus, lack of purpose, and an unhealthy skepticism that anything other than a beer is worth saying. But if a beer is worth saying, maybe so too is a rubber rain boot, or a hummingbird feeder, or a crocus. I doubt that anyone will understand how I'm always upside down about it. And by it, I mean the noise and the terrible work of poetry. Last night, I was thinking about the beginning of Wallace Stevens's poem, Man Carrying Thing, which goes, a poem should resist its subject almost successfully. Except that isn't what it says. I misremembered the actual quote. The actual quote says, a poem should resist the intellect almost successfully, not its subject. But I think I like my misremembered version better, as resisting a subject, both in terms of resisting the self, the fix one is in, and a particular kind of summarizable, paraphrasable content in general is more useful. I'm always misremembering things. Very often I'm even deliberate about it. Why do anything correctly when you can revel in the wonder of error and not knowing? Creativity isn't a matter of what you know. It's a matter of what you don't know. One way to be creative is to do something wrong, is to make a mistake or be mistaken. I suppose I think that's a good place to be, stretched across the crevasse of knowing something and not, one foot in disclarity and the other in eternity. I'm not even half as chaotic as I think I'd like to be. A poem should resist. A poem should. A poem. Talk 10. For whom the light explodes. And this last talk is in 3 parts. I told you they were short, but maybe not short enough. 1, recently on a trip to Chicago, I got on the I-90 tollway just outside of Gary, Indiana, and found myself in a stressful situation at an automatic toll station that couldn't read the magnetic strips on either of my credit cards and wouldn't, for whatever reason, I can only imagine the machine was broken, take my cash. After several minutes of card read error, messages, and frantically trying to stick 1s and 5s into the cash slot, I pressed the press for help button several times, but no one answered. There were no toll station attendants. It was kind of weird and abandoned looking in a big brother, someone is watching kind of way. I mean, occasionally there were some other cars moving through in other lanes, but not many. Apparently, the cars getting through all had either credit cards with a readable magnetic strip or an easy pass. Because I was stuck, I looked around and got distracted. I wondered if other people were ever struck by how similar an unattended toll station looks to the entrance of a prison. This one in particular, with its chain link fences topped with barbed wire on either side, the concrete barriers, the faceless machine with the robo voice saying card read error or inactive card over and over again in my direction, and the robots in the other lane saying, thank you, proceed with caution. It was all kind of ominous, monotonous, typical. The lane I was in was supposedly the only one that took cash, but as I said, the cash eater machine was broken. Ultimately, I had to back out of the lane and barrel through one of the easy pass lanes, which fortunately wasn't gated. All the others were, so that was odd, not to mention lucky. I don't know what I would have done if all the gates had been down. There was no way to turn around. And anyway, I had poetry business to attend to in Chicago. I was in a hurry. Time was wasting. I would have gladly paid the toll, but since I couldn't, I had to find another way. And that involved breaking the rule that a toll must be paid to continue. Before I started writing this, which whatever this is, I'm pretty sure it has almost nothing to do with tolls. I spent about 15 minutes online trying to figure out which toll I didn't pay so I could pay it now a couple of weeks after the fact. But then I got bored and annoyed that they make it so hard to figure out which toll it was, what I might owe, and how to actually pay that I gave up. Now I am a toll road outlaw. It's possible, I suppose, that they, whoever they are, took a picture of my license plate, and at some point in the future, I will receive a ticket in the mail. But even if I do, now I definitely won't pay it. That ship has sailed. Also, I like the idea that I got away with something. 2. Whenever I write a poem or get to give a talk or a whole bunch of them, I feel like I'm getting away with something. And certainly I feel that way when I think about the fact that I'm a poet. You can be a poet, a young person once asked me in the Q&A session after a reading. Apparently, you can be whatever you want in art. As an art of imaginative possibility, poetry is the end of all authority, if only temporarily, as it renders the world in terms other than it is. The word squirrel is not a squirrel, but we draw between them a meaningful equivalence. In poetry, however, even the word squirrel might not signify a squirrel. It might signify death or a portmanteau of longing. Poetry is the end of all authority because it dismantles the security cameras and guard towers of language, the grammar, the expectations, the rules in favor of pressing one's face up against the limits of whatever they are and wherever you roam. And sometimes we break through. Sometimes. But for me, what matters is the process. What's the process? Mostly, I'm a bird against a window again. I am a crash site, or so. I get up off the soft, feathery grass and brush myself off. The sun is shining, or the moon says, 2 people wearing ice skates walk into a bar. That's weird. I take to the sky again, and then I crash hard or harder or hardest. Sometimes a bit of barbed wire catches a wing. Sometimes I get to the abandoned toll station, which I first typed as tool station, and just drive right through. If the gate is down, I break it. It's a revolutionary act to write a poem. There is no toll required other than the bells. Music is important, and people may think you're weird or wasting your time because you've dedicated yourself to something which produces no capital. How do you pay your tolls? I don't. So many things in this life do, in fact, take a toll, but poetry breathes a little life into it, even when crashing repeatedly. So yes, and to circle back, as a poet, I am always getting away with something, but I'm also being taken away by it, taken with it, written into the fabric of the concrete grass, the plastic sky, the alluvial, the azure, the colossal living hum. There are billions of connections that only need making. Suddenly a spark, everything explodes, cufflinks, squid ink, a pink German shepherd on a neon green leash. Or if it's a Siberian husky, the bartender asks the people wearing ice skates what they'd like, and they say, anything, as long as it's on ice. Apparently their ankles are killing them. With me, it's my angles or my angels, which aren't better. They grrr, they syllogism, but I am skeptical of all logic, all narrative, all claims to knowledge. If I could grow a beard like an interstate, I would. 3. It seemed weird to end this after 2 sections. So here's one more, no doubt shorter section to remind us. Remind us of what? Remind us of this quotation from the poet A.R. Ammons. Poetry has one subject, impermanence, which it presents with as much permanence as possible. My poems often leap from image to image, idea to idea, impression to impression, because the house is changing all around me as I write them. And the rug is being pulled out from under me where I walk. And everything is just a little off kilter in the gloaming. So what I see is only what I think I see. And given that there are, according to Burnett via Coleridge, more invisible things in the world than visible ones, I am recording what I can in the way that makes the most sense, which isn't sensible. It's a demonstration of a particular way of paying attention, my way of paying attention, which I hope is recognizable to you, and also baffling to you as it is to me, in the ways that make us the most permanent versions of ourselves that we can be to each other, despite the endless shifting and the changing of the light. Every inkling has some ink in it. I call and call and call for your response. Are you out there? Do you read me? So I would be more than happy to try to answer questions if people have them. I definitely have never given a talk like that before. Let's see.
Hey, Matt, I got a question.
Okay, great.
Awesome. First of all, really amazing. Thank you so much. I just that I mean, just in the last part that well, one, I'll just, I am curious if they do end up charging you for that toll. I'll just side note, I'll be curious about that. Two, that notion of taking with, or being taken with, or taken, like it's taken away and taking with, was I think the phrasing that you used, and those are two different, I think those are, or I think you mean to express them as two different conditions, but that are also really entangled. And I'm wondering if you could just think a little bit more about that, like even in the act of composition, when you feel, like when something is really taking you,
Right. Well, as I said at the beginning of these talks, like I definitely am never prescribe a way for anybody to proceed, but I will tell you that for me, I'm a poet who doesn't have any ideas ever, and so the only way I'm ever going to write again is to sit down and begin to put words on the page and try to see where they might take me. And in putting words together and placing phrases next to one another and writing lines and writing sentences and breaking those things apart, I'm always trying to see if something develops out of that, if the language seems to want to go somewhere. And sometimes the language takes me somewhere that it wants to go entirely. Sometimes and I've said, I think I said this in the workshop the other day, but sometimes the language allows me to get to the things that are on my mind that I have no idea are on my mind. So I don't have any ideas, but obviously I'm a human being. Human beings are complicated and human beings do have ideas, but sometimes it's really hard to know what those ideas are. And so I'm always trying to be on the lookout for where the language might point to, or what it might suggest, or how it makes me feel, or what it makes me think of. And I try to follow it where it goes. And I love the idea of being taken by writing as opposed to sort of taking writing for a ride. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what it made me think.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay, great.
I really resonate with your yearning for like more chaos and more, I don't know if like unintelligibility is the word, but this like new attempt at language and new use of language. And you said things to the effect of like always wanting to be more chaotic or more, I don't know, I just picture like you screaming, honestly, when I'm saying this, you know, more of that, whatever that is. And I'm wondering if you have a way to access that kind of energy, right? Like the counter energy to like writing things that make sense in order to make money, in order to be understood. Like, how do you access the other side of that?
There are a variety of methods, I think, that I probably apply in writing. You know, one really simple one, right? I mean, part of it is about getting out of my own way, right? And getting out of my own head and sort of letting the language do the work, right? So, you know, one way of doing that, right? I think about the fact that I have friends who do really have ideas and they have things that they want sort of to say. And I think that's amazing. If you do, like, oh, that's so fantastic. Follow your heart wherever it takes you. But it, you know, without having that, I'm always trying to find ways to create parameters for myself that sort of allow me to work with and against whatever the language is at hand. So, I mean, you know, one example is take a poem that you love by someone else, type the poem out, leave a line in between every line of that poem, write a new line in between every line of that poem, then ditch all the old lines, see what's there, right? Or, you know, I practice lots of different kinds of you know, grammatical translation, right? Like take something that you love, change every word in the poem to its opposite, change it to, you know, an antonym, right? Antonymic translation, right? Which is easy if the word is hot, because then you replace it with cold, probably, right? But what is it if the word is gerbil? The opposite of a gerbil is a giraffe, as everyone knows, or a pterodactyl. Pterodactyl. Well, what it does is it, like, you know, you're trying to sort of activate your associative mind in some way. You know, another sort of thing that I do to instill some chaos is very often I type poems on my manual typewriter. And I didn't make this up, by the way. I took this from someone else, but I type poems on my manual typewriter and I'll look at them, and then I'll go to one of my bookshelves. Maybe you can see the bookshelves around here. And I close my eyes and I pull a book off the shelf and I stick the poem inside it and I put it back on the shelf, and then I open my eyes. And then, you know, occasionally I'll be going through the books and I'll find a poem that I stuck in a book. And then, you know, if I still like it, I'll work on it. But you know, I'm always trying to find ways to get out of my own way. I mean, those are just a few, but there are a lot of them. I find that, like, rephrasing things, you know, rewriting things in terms of synonyms, breaking things up into tiny pieces, taking a poem that's maybe in, you know, 14 stanzas and putting one stanza on 14 pages. I'm also really interested in taking sort of formal constraints and trying to mess them up. So, you know, it's like we think about a sonnet as being 14 lines long, but what if you wrote a sonnet where the first line was 14 lines, the second line was 13 lines, the third line was 12 lines, the fourth line was 11 lines, all the way down to 1. So you have a sonnet that decays, and maybe there's some repetition involved in that.
Matt,
I'm not really satisfied with that answer, Edie.
That was great. Thank you.
Alejandro.
How you doing? Thanks for the talk. I guess I wanted to ask you a question, but I have a preliminary one to help me ask my bigger one. When you write the poems that you write every day, or the ones you've been talking about sticking in books, do they have dates? The first draft?
They don't.
Okay.
Typically do not date them.
All right.
I will say that a couple of years ago, when I was typing a poem every single day on my Remington Noiseless #7, and I was attempting to type a poem every single day for a year, and I was after I would pull it out of the typewriter, I'd put it face down on my desk, and I wasn't allowed to look at the poem until the end of the year. And I did date all of those, but largely so that I could, ensure that I had in fact written one that day.
Right.
More than because I wanted to timestamp it somehow.
All right. Let me ask my bigger question then. Thank you for that. So I was trying to think about a couple of things while I was listening to you, and maybe it sort of came to me when you said at the end the bit about not having ideas and other people have ideas. And I guess I'm going to accept that statement from you just as a description of the way people go about writing.
Yeah.
But to kind of push you on it a little bit and see if we, because I can imagine, this is why I was asking about the dates. There are writers, and I guess I'm thinking mainly of kind of older writers like Samuel Pepys or John Evelyn, who just wrote these massive lifelong diaries. There's also people that are copious letter writers like Walpole, where it's like, what is it about? Man, it's just kind of what they did every day and what they saw, and but it sort of becomes as a document an idea of the place and time, not so much the writer's own attempt to put that into a frame, but just by being faithful. And to choose a more contemporary example, I was looking at this earlier, Joanne Kiger's collected poems, big thick book. And one of the interesting things about this is that unlike a lot of collecteds, which are organized in books, this one is just, I don't know if it's all her poems, but it's a whole lot of her poems in chronological order. Because Kiger had this thing from early on that she dated all her poems. Yeah. And I even remember hearing a story about when she was well along in years, like a younger poet showing Kiger the poems, and she was like, "These are really great, but you gotta put the date." So is there something comparable, right? Where yes, I accept on the face of it that you're not, it's not an idea that sets you to write or that you think the poem should be about. But a big fat pile of Matt Hart poems is a kind of document, right? That does something, that could do something as well, because you're so dedicated to cranking them out.
Yeah. I will say that I'm always sort of flummoxed when I get to a place where I feel like I have that big pile of poems, and I feel like for whatever reason that it's sort of come to an end. I enjoy the work of having something to do every day, and of just allowing that work to accumulate. Sometimes I don't even go back and look at the poems. And certainly I don't always collect them into books. There's a sense, at least at this point in my life, where I'm like, well, what else would I do? And here's the other thing I'll say is that, and I alluded to this in the talk too, but poetry is one of the primary ways that I have come to make sense of the world and my experience and other people. And without it, I'm lost. I mean, I really do feel like I'm adrift at sea. When I finish a big project, it's always like, okay, now what do I do? Like, I need to have some kind of process to be able to like continue. The accumulation of that, even if no one ever sees it, is important to me.
Thanks. I have a follow-up, but I want to leave space for other people, so I'll wait and see or take it up some other time. Thank you, Matt.
I have a question, and you can think of this as a continuation of Edie's in a sense. You still feel unsatisfied with your answer. I think you mentioned, and I don't remember your words, but you had done some revision of this talk very recently. And I was wondering, what was the difference? What did that revision do for you? And in the sense of like inserting oneself at the last moment, do you feel like that helped you get away from yourself nonetheless?
Yeah, I don't know if I feel the same way about the talks as I feel about the poems. Sadly, in the talks, I feel like Matt Hart is too much with us. But I will say that I wrote 22 of these talks. So I gave you 10. And a lot of them would need to be developed a lot further in order to do anything with them, or there were a couple of them that got too long, and I was like, well, I could maybe turn this into like a longer talk on its own later. So I didn't want to use those. And then, yesterday I read through the talks and I didn't feel like it was, and it was a feeling more than anything, but I didn't feel like it was cohering as much as it could. And I felt like I was repeating myself in places too much. So I took 3 or 4 different talks out, and then I added 2. And one was the Husker Du talk. Like, that was not going to actually be in there. But then I suddenly realized I was like, I really like the idea of doing a talk that is sort of more traditional in the sense that it's like close reading of a poem, but I also loved the idea that it was like close reading of 3 words for 2.5 pages. I will say on revision that I revise a lot. I mean, I think revision is really important. I'm a really process-oriented poet, but I'm definitely not a first thought, best thought person. I like writing every day, and if something feels like it's really working or it's humming, then I'm going to want to actually work on it and come back to it again and again, probably. I mean, I had a book that came out last fall and I'm still revising that. I revise as I read very often. I'll be giving a reading of poems, and I'll like leave out 5 stanzas, or I'll add a stanza while I'm doing it. It's the language is inexhaustible, and it's endless, and it's always pointing somewhere else. And I feel like it's my job to try to figure out what that is as best I can, given whatever the context happens to be in that particular moment. I'm also a huge believer in the idea that quantity leads to quality eventually. So, if you want to write 10 good talks, you might have to write like 22 or something, and maybe then even those 10 you write that you share aren't that great. But I do think that, if you write 25 poems in a weekend, if you, Roz, write 25 poems in a weekend, 3 or 4 of them are going to be great. There's no doubt. And some of them are probably going to be ones you could revise and make great. And then there'll be some that were you practicing to write the great ones, right?
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Let's give Matt a hand. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, workshop in 58 minutes.